Hello, everybody. Welcome from near and far online to our program today by Dr. Patricia Kim on Hellenistic Queens. My name is Shelby Brown, and I'm very happy to be representing the Getty Villa in Los Angeles, which is the Getty's Antiquities Museum that hosts our collection of ancient Greek, Roman, and Etruscan art. Our talk today is in honor of both National Women's History Month in March and International Women's Day coming up on March 8th. And International Women's Day has been around for over 100 years, as of course have many of the issues still impacting women. I am truly pleased to welcome Dr. Kim, who's an art historian and independent curator based in New York City and an assistant professor at New York University. Dr. Kim earned her BA in History of Art and Near Eastern Studies from Berkeley and her PhD in History of Art from the University of Pennsylvania. She focuses on the ancient Mediterranean and Western Asia and explores topics such as gender, race, and power in her teaching, her research, and her exhibitions. And I'm not starting with her knowledge of ancient queens directly, because I want to note that instead of staying grounded only in the past, Dr. Kim brings her perspectives to bear on contemporary issues as well, including the environment and the ways cultural monuments are created and interpreted, often unfairly. She's very interested in interpretation and in questioning public art in antiquity and today. Patricia, I hope I am representing you fairly. She's worked with Monument Lab, a public art and history space in Philadelphia. One of her interesting projects was to help develop activities for museum visitors to uncover what museums are not saying alongside the messages they intend to send. And as we are a museum, it's an interesting, wonderful thing to watch. As a professor, she's been teaching classes on royal women and the art and archaeology of race in the ancient Mediterranean. And she's teaching her first-year seminar students how to think and research using the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And some of you may remember that she joined us 2 years ago with Dr. Aaron Thompson to present what to do with a smashed statue. And in that presentation, they brought ancient practices of erasing people into today, and that's available on Getty's YouTube channel. Most relevant today is Dr. Kim's research on the art and material culture of queenship in the Hellenistic period, so after the death of Alexander the Great, and especially from the 4th to 2nd centuries BCE. Last year, she co-edited the book Queens in Antiquity and the Present with Bloomsbury Press, and in June this year, she has a book coming out with Cambridge University Press called The Art of Queenship in the Hellenistic World. Dr. Kim is also guest curating an exhibition relevant to this subject at the Cincinnati Art Museum. So we are extremely happy to have her to present on ancient queens and to also make them relevant. Patricia, I turn over to you.
Thank you so much, Shelby, for that very generous introduction. And I'd also like to thank Lisa and Aram, as well as the numerous folks who are working very hard behind the screen to make sure that this program runs smoothly. And of course, to you watching from wherever you are, may it be work, your home, school even, I'm really thrilled that you could join us during what might be your lunchtime. I'm just really excited to share some of my thinking and research with you all. So let's begin. What is a queen to you? For some, the term queen might call to mind the royal monarchs of modern-day nation states like the recently deceased Queen of England or the living Queen of Thailand. Now, as symbolic as their roles are in the 21st century, these queens are, and historically were, in close proximity to political power and themselves come from storied bloodlines of prestige. The title queen is also bestowed to public figures who serve as models of outstanding achievement in their fields. Think megastars like Madonna, Beyonce, Cher, icons who are universally recognized by their first names. In queer communities across the United States today, the title queen has long been reclaimed from the pejorative and instead now mobilized as an exclamatory remark of praise, mutual regard, and kin-making. Indeed, the title of queen can be readily given to folks with relatively little ruling power, but nevertheless embody courage, vision, and generosity. Like my own mother, I see her as my queen. Now, in antiquity, too, the definition for what it meant to be a queen could vary across different geocultural contexts. Select royal women during the Hellenistic period were referred to publicly with the title of basilissa, which literally translates to female basileus or female king. This title from the Hellenistic period, at least, is perhaps the closest to our modern notion of queen, though the title basilissa does not necessarily measure or equate with the title holder's political agency or authority any more than the modern title of queen does today. Today's talk, and indeed my work on the art of queenship, does not solely focus on titled women. Rather, in my study, queens refer to a broad group of dynastic and royal women who had proximity to political ruling power, and in very unique cases could wield political power themselves. Furthermore, in this discussion today, as well as in my book, the term queenship does not actually refer to a state of ruling power or political agency. Rather, I take queenship as a conceptual framework for understanding the specific art historical phenomenon in which dynastic women, or queens, became important to articulating and expressing dynastic and sometimes even imperial power throughout the Hellenistic world. My research on queenship focuses on a broader corpus of material and visual culture of royal and dynastic women. And here I want to shamelessly plug my forthcoming monograph with Cambridge University Press called The Art of Queenship in the Hellenistic World, that Shelby mentioned earlier, and that you can pre-order by searching for it online. Now, we only have about 40 to 45 minutes together, and here's how they'll go. So first, I'm going to set the scene. I'll briefly contextualize the historical and geographic particularities of the Hellenistic period and its politics. Then I move on to introduce and discuss various objects and monuments that I find particularly compelling for how they portrayed the power of Hellenistic queens, starting just a few generations before the official historical beginning of the Hellenistic period. And I do this, so that is before Alexander the Great's death, and I do this for reasons that I hope will become clear in just a moment. I then build on these earlier 4th century examples, discussing some specific ways in which representations of queens were integral to portrayals of power in antiquity. In particular, the time I have allotted today allows for a specific focus on the importance of a queen's multiple kinship roles in both representations of queenship and in expressions of Hellenistic dynastic power more broadly. Now, as a disclaimer, I should say that there's more to say about queens and queenship and about the various artworks and monuments that I will show. But I focus on this particular aspect of queenship, that is the important role of kinship, in this 45-minute talk because it is such a prominent theme throughout the corpus. Now, for historians, the Hellenistic world begins with the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE and ends with the death of Cleopatra the Great in about 30 BCE. In addition to a historical period, the Hellenistic world refers to a geographic and cultural entity, or geographic and cultural entities, I should say. The Hellenistic world describes a vast geography encompassing 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia. And as you can see on this beautiful borderless map, the Hellenistic world includes swaths of the Mediterranean, including Northern Africa and Asia Minor, east towards the Iranian plateau and up to the Indus. The imperial conquest led by Alexander ushered in an age of transformations in politics and art, which reflected the dynamic shifts that resulted from intense cultural encounters. One such shift that I discuss here has to do with the place of women in the history of ancient art. So, Shifts that have to do with art making itself, for instance, are embodied by this object at the Getty Museum or the Getty Villa, which is a fragmentary faience oinokoe, or pitcher, with a relief depiction of Queen Berenike II of Ptolemaic Egypt offering libations at an altar on behalf of a royal cult. Now, we're going to come back to this object in more depth later. Now, representations of queens throughout the Hellenistic world reflected the diversity of this interconnected geographic and cultural space. And Hellenistic queens, it turns out, were represented across a number of different styles, materials, and iconographies, demonstrating the creativity and artistic innovations that characterize this period. Moreover, queens are represented at a variety of different scales. For example, on portable objects that can be admired closely by hand, like fabulous gems or worn on the body, although no longer available to close admiration by our own hands, excuse me, or worn on the body, like bone finger rings. We also have examples of queens represented at much larger scales, with evidence for portraits that are just over life size or colossal, displayed in public spaces and sacred contexts. Despite the wide diversity of artistic styles and modes of representation, my research has also found a number of qualities, practices, and concepts of and for queenship that were shared across the Hellenistic world. In this talk, I focus on select examples and on the roles and responsibilities related to kinship. Another important note before we dive in: as I will demonstrate, the story of Hellenistic queens and Hellenistic queenship begins a couple of generations before Alexander's death at the beginning of the 4th century. Despite the modern historians' practice of dating the Hellenistic period from the dates 323 to about 30 BCE, some of the trends that we see throughout Hellenistic period dynastic and royal art emerge from earlier 4th century practices. And as such, no history of Hellenistic art is complete without a robust consideration of earlier 4th century foundations. Returning to this map, by the late 5th century, male dynasts ruled over regions throughout the Eastern Mediterranean alongside Greek city-states and the imperial forces of the Achaemenid Persians. These ruling dynasties commissioned art, and much of this was very public. My research has revealed just how profound those changes to dynastic art were. See, one such major change was that dynastic women began to appear in public art throughout the Eastern Mediterranean just before the military conquests of Alexander. 4th century dynastic women were publicly active and could take on politically important roles, it also turns out, usually alongside their husbands or kings. We have records, or historians have identified records that speak to the ways in which queens quelled arguments, arranged marriages for the poor, helped facilitate cases of manumission, and participated in royal spectacles, to name only a handful of examples. But what can their representations in public art tell us about the conceptual and political contours of later Hellenistic queenship? Let's begin with our first case study, the so-called Nereid monument. This monument puts Hellenistic phenomena, or a number of these phenomena, in a slightly broader historical and political context. For example, you can see the fusion of sculptural and architectural styles and motifs, the use of monuments to memorialize kings. But here, I want to talk about the Nereid monument through a new lens, through that of queenship. In particular, this monument articulates an aspect of queenship that would continue to be expressed across the Hellenistic world. That is, the central role and responsibility of dynastic women in matters of maintaining the dynastic family. This monument was built at Xanthos, the ancient capital of Lycia in what is now Western Turkey. The so-called Nereid monument was built around 380 for the dynast Arbanus, who decided to build his hero shrine and tomb in a prominent location atop a hillside just above the gateway to the city. This monument is named by modern scholars for the 11 breathtaking over life-sized female bodies that seem to resemble the Greek nymphs of the sea or nereids. Other scholars have discussed at length the city siege friezes encircling two horizontal bands on the podium just beneath the nereids, you can see. And on that podium, these city siege scenes glorify Arbenus as a brilliant military as well as a brilliant political ruler, thus inflecting the funerary monument with triumphal themes. Other sculptural fragments that were found nearby the Nereid monument include scenes of mythical abduction, which probably crowned the original monument as acroteria. So we have a monument with themes of manliness, myth, and might. So far, fairly standard for a dynastic monument, but this monument did something different. Some aspects of the monument's visual program represent dynastic femininity. At the center of the monument's east pediment, the left corner of which is now lost, an enthroned man and woman face each other. Depicted at the same scale, the two figures sit on a horizontal picture plane, signaling that they belong together both conceptually and physically. With his long hair and beard, his bare torso and scepter, the man is undoubtedly Arbenus. You'll notice underneath his throne, a sleeping dog curls, highlighting the theme of domesticity while alluding to his pursuits in the outer world, perhaps as a hunter. The fully clothed woman holds up the edge of her veil toward Arbenus, seemingly in a bridal gesture otherwise known as anacalypsis, that symbolizes her status as wife. Now, flanking them, you can see are smaller figures that have been theorized as either the couple's children or their lower status attendants, or perhaps a mix of both. Regardless, altogether, this pediment demonstrates an oikos, or a household, and a ruler's household consists not only members related by blood and marriage, but also those that worked on behalf of that household, its property, and at least conceptually, the ruler's domain. Thus, the east pediment of the Nereid monument, at the very least, provides a glimpse into a dynastic couple in a domestic setting. Arbenus's visual program certainly follows preceding traditions of elite and dynastic representation found across Anatolia and the Aegean. For example, there are a number of images in which you have couples who are usually banqueting together in death. But there are two things, well, maybe three things that make this east pediment stand out. First, this couple is not banqueting, so it's a little bit of a twist on this Lycian motif of the couple together in death. Second is the fact of the monument's publicness. And third is that the monument is a dynastic one, prompting deeper questions about the monumentality of dynastic women in the region at this time. Notice again that the pediment aligns the dynastic man and woman together on the same horizontal plane. They're at the same scale. There's no banqueting equipment. Thus, this is not just a scene of a husband and wife in death. It was and became a public image that served as a new kind of expression of dynastic power. That is, a representation of a dynastic couple and its court, thus signaling its continuity or its hopes for continuity into the future. Now, it's clear that the Nereid monument's representation of the dynastic couple inspired other dynastic monumental projects in Lycia, but also beyond. Take, for instance, the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, built around 350 in Caria, further south, also in Western Turkey. We know, based on archaeological evidence, that this monument featured a large gallery of dynastic women and men from multiple generations of the Hecatomnid clan. The construction of this monument, by the way, is said by Pliny to have been overseen partially or built partially by Artemisia II, Mausolus's sister and wife, and we will come back to sister wives in just a moment. Now, out of the 44 fragments of colossal statuary found, there are at least 11 different figures identified, 5 of which are identifiably women, thanks to remaining details of their costumes, their hair, so costumes including sandals, veils, and headgear. And here you'll see projected on your screens the most complete and famous sculptural examples from the mausoleum now on display at the British Museum, the so-called Mausolus statue on your right and the so-called Artemisia II statue on the left, although there is no evidence at all that these are either Mausolus or Artemisia. Could be, but there's no way in actually identifying these figures as such. Evidence of at least 4 other female heads with snail coil curls wrapped by a sakos cap, which is a hairstyle that's typical of hecatomnid women, were also excavated. And I just love this shot of this particular head. I think it's very evocative. Now, returning to the so-called Artemisia statue, although her limbs and face are missing, her arms, as you can tell from where they're cut off, probably projected outward and upward, similar to what you might think of in Christian art or early Christian art as the orans posture. And important for our discussion here, this gesture seems to choreograph this Carian dynastic woman in a perpetual state of speech or prayer, perhaps symbolizing her public voice. But at the very least, one can imagine her arms projecting outward in a kind of more active motion. Now, Christine Jeppesen suggests that as many as 28 family members may have stood between the columns encircling the podium of the mausoleum, and for George Waywell, as many as 36 members and ancestors of the Hecatomnid clan were on display. Although the number of kin members and their positions on the mausoleum, that is to say which podium and which platform they were displayed on, is or are unknown, the monument certainly displayed multiple hecatomnid women within a dynastic context, perhaps adapting and expanding on the Nereid monument's picture of a dynastic family. George Waywell also speculated that in addition to these ancestor galleries, portrait statues of Mausolus and Artemisia II were placed atop the roof in a chariot or leading or as if driving the horses in dynastic triumph, given the estimated width of the chariot, which could have perhaps comfortably included 2 over life-size figural statues. If the monument's chariot did indeed include Artemisia, we might consider what it meant to represent multiple generations of a particular dynastic clan, and also consider what it meant to present the image of a royal couple as the monument's crowning jewel. A decade or so later, further west at Olympia, the Argead dynast and father of Alexander the Great, Philip II, commissioned the Philippeion, a large rotunda monument about 15 meters in diameter that featured a multi-generational family portrait, like that of the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, but here instead with 5 select family members. So of course, Philip II stands proudly and triumphantly in the middle, and he's accompanied by his father and his mother, Amyntas and Eurydice, and one of his many wives, Olympias, and his son with Olympias, Alexander, who would later then be called the Great. This monument was built in the Altis, the most sacred area at Olympia, facing the temple of Hera, goddess of marriage, and visible from the front end of the temple of Zeus, king of the gods. Here at the Altis, Philip was in good company, recognized among other military and athletic heroes, a fitting context and marker for the hegemon, or leader within the League of Corinth, and the most powerful man in the Eastern Mediterranean at the time. And yet the Philippeion also contrasted with other victory markers and trophies in the Altis by representing the Argead dynasty as a whole, or rather multiple members and generations of this dynasty, including dynastic women, rather than just representing the singular figure of Philip as a hero all by himself. Thus, queens, that is, dynastic and royal women at the dawn of the Hellenistic period, were central to conveying the political importance of the dynastic family and perhaps even the dynast himself. as well as in conveying the importance of their roles within the dynastic family: wife, mother, daughter, and sister. These roles were not just matters of political succession, they became representations of power and ideological and aesthetic tools that expressed dynastic stability, legitimacy, and continuity. Let's now turn squarely to a selection of examples from the Hellenistic period proper, when royal patrons and artists again devised a number of creative, even innovative modes of expressing queenship in terms of kinship, while simultaneously evoking such ideologically entrenched dynastic messages. What we'll find is that such queenship roles and responsibilities found expression across a wide variety of materials and contexts. Now, for one thing, rulers did not stop commissioning public monuments on behalf of their family members, from dynastic family portraits to single family members, or portraits of single family members. The 2nd century Attalid king, Attalos II, commissioned a statue to his mother, Apollonius, again in the temenos of Athena Polias on the Pergamene Acropolis. Though her bronze statue is missing, the circular marble base preserves this inscription. Attalus set up this statue of Basilissa, Apollonius, his mother, for the sake of her affection towards him. Not only does Attalus's dedication identify Apollonius as his mother, but it also strategically identifies her relation to him, as well as her perceived maternal quality of affection as a motivation for honoring her. Even the 2nd century Greek historian Polybius described Apollonius in writing as, quote, having given birth to 4 sons, she cherished for all of them up to her dying day an unsurpassed regard and affection, although she survived her husband for a considerable time. Thus demonstrating the degree to which the importance of motherhood to queenship, as well as the important role of queenship to dynastic cohesion and stability, had become so well known that it was basically a trope. So well known, indeed, that even non-royal subjects honored their dynastic rulers with monuments that included queens in prominent ways. Staying with the Attalid dynasty, in the 170s, a man named Monogenes, who served as viceroy for the Attalids, commissioned a royal family portrait in the sanctuary of Athena Polias at Pergamon again, for which only the semicircular base is preserved. This base indicates that 7 bronze statues of Attalid royal family members were displayed, including the already deceased Attalus I and his wife Apollonius, their son Eumenes II and Eumenes' wife Stratonike, and their sons Attalus III, Philotyrus II, and Athenaeus. Much like the Philippeion, 2 key queens, here the mothers and wives of Attalid kings, are included in public honors, a strategy that mobilized portrayals of queenship as a political and artistic tactic already a century in the making. Such qualities were likewise more directly communicated via the epigraphic record, that is, inscriptions that not only identified the name of the queen honored, but also listed qualities that emphasized their relevance and importance as family members. So let's stay with inscriptions just a bit longer and look at this specific, and look at some specific epithets that some queens were given. These epithets likewise reinforced their kinship roles. Here you're looking at a very fragmented marble base of a cult statue to the Ptolemaic Queen of Egypt, Arsinoe II, again dedicated by a non-royal subject. Cult statues, like the one that this base once displayed, were installed in temples and ritual spaces throughout the territories of the Ptolemaic Empire, in Egypt, and across the Eastern Mediterranean. Arsinoe II's cult facilitated the production of her portrait en masse for at least 2 centuries after her death. Indeed, Hellenistic queen cults preserved and presented an image of queenship that communicated a queen's cultural, political, and social importance. On the front of the base, a Greek inscription tells us that this dedication was made by an Aristocles, son of another Aristocles, an Alexandrian, on behalf of Arsinoe Philadelphus, or Arsinoe, the sibling lover, or brother lover. emphasizing her important role as not only the wife to King Ptolemy II, but also his sister, and a consanguineal sister at that, which means fully blood related. They share the same parents. Now, to marry your sibling is a choice that is different. Okay, it's a very weird choice, or it might be a weird choice to you. It is a little bit to me in our contemporary society. But this choice was seen as savvy in antiquity, for the marriage between siblings would help to elevate the dynastic couple to divine status. You see, only the gods married their siblings, Zeus and Hera, Osiris and Isis. Around the death of Arsinoe II in about 272 or 271, the cult of the Theoi Adelphoi, or the sibling gods, became central to Ptolemaic dynastic identity and shaped notions of royal femininity as well. About simultaneously, the court of Ptolemy II established the cult on behalf of their deceased parents, Ptolemy I and Berenike, the cult of the Theoi Soteris, or the savior gods. And of course, this is also around the time that Arsinoe II, Philadelphos herself, was deified and garnered that very popular, long-lasting cult. Thus, royal cults were established at the very beginning of the Ptolemaic period, and were quite central to royal image production for the next several centuries. Though I want to note here that royal cults were not unique to the Ptolemies, and that other rulers throughout the Hellenistic world strategically created and maintained them. The concept of the divine dynastic family was claimed across a diverse plethora of royal Ptolemaic art. An intriguing example that I am unable to project here for copyright reasons, but I highly encourage for you to search online, can be found at the University of Chicago's Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures Museum. This object is a basalt base for another cult statue of Arsinoe II, and likewise includes a Greek inscription, Arsinoe Philadelphus, across the front of the pedestal. Now, as you search for this base, or I can describe it to you, on top of the face of the pedestal, right next to where the queen's two striding feet stood, is a long Egyptian inscription in hieroglyphs that lists the divine roles and royal attributes afforded to the queen, including daughter of Amun, God's wife, sister of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, royal sister of the king, and so on. Thus, the Egyptian inscription not only traces her dynastic lineage, but also describes her divine kinship to Egyptian gods and goddesses. Both the Egyptian and Greek inscriptions, we learn, demonstrate the importance of the concept of the divine household in portraying queenship. Likewise, by memorializing the queen as the wife, sister, and daughter of gods, the dynasty could project, both materially and symbolically, both their divinity and power. Further east in the Seleucid realm of, or rather Seleucid-controlled Mesopotamia, a barrel-shaped clay cylinder about 23 centimeters in length and 10 centimeters in diameter, inscribed with Babylonian cuneiform, was excavated at the site of the Azida, or the temple to the god Nabu, at Borsippa, which is located some 12 miles south of Babylon. Datable to around 268 BCE, the royal cylinder of Antiochus, often called Antiochus, the Antiochus cylinder in scholarship, includes a long inscription in deliberately archaizing Babylonian script that wraps around the entire tablet and then organized into two columns. The script praises and thanks the Seleucid dynasty for their support in rebuilding the Azida, and includes the names of both Antiochus and Stratonike, as well as the name of Seleucus, Antiochus's father. So it reads, or a section, a small portion of this long inscription reads, "O Nabu, first son, when you enter the Azida, the true house may favor for Antiochus, king of lands, and favor for Seleucus, the king, his son, and Stratonike, his consort, the queen, be in your mouth." Overall, the cylinder provides a glimpse into how the Seleucid dynasts appealed to local communities under their control, especially appealing to elites and authorities by following well-established protocols for dynastic foundation deposits and monumental dedications at very ancient temples. Centuries earlier, the Achaemenid king Cyrus deposited a cylinder foundation in around 539, inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform at Babylon. Yet the Antiochus cylinder departs from earlier royal foundation deposits by explicitly naming Stratonice in its inscription. See, prior cylinder inscriptions never included a royal woman's name. As Susan Sherwin-White and Amelie Kurt discuss, the cylinder includes the archaic cuneiform terms hirtu and sharatu, which first appeared in the second millennium and translate to principal wife and queen, respectively. More recently, Monica Vidmar argues that the title hirtu and sharatu are Akkadian translation of the Hellenistic title Vasilissa, which, within a polygamous court context, served to enhance her status while adapting a model that directly followed Neo-Assyrian titular practices. And this enhancement of status via text and inscription, of course, aligns with the enhancement of status in dynastic family monuments, such including the ones that we discussed at Olympia and Pergamon. Now, surely this cylinder is not a portrait representation. Nevertheless, it certainly does portray the Queen Stratonice and says something important about queenship as such. Although this monumental document was buried underneath the temple's walls and encased in kiln-burnt bricks and covered with bitumen, the entire process of the cylinder's construction, its inscription, and its dedication evoked the presence of a dynasty. And by including Stratonice alongside the two Seleucid kings, it conveyed the dynasty's legitimacy and also its continuity. See, the inclusion of Stratonice's name does not prove that gender constructs and gender roles changed to include women in political or priestly matters at Babylon or elsewhere. Rather, the priestly caste and scribes generated a text and a monument that reflected relatively new modes of Hellenistic royal enunciation in the region by presenting Stratonice and Antiochus together in an object type that traditionally did not include the consort, all while adapting a monumental practice of evoking the presence of royal figures through inscriptions of their names. Indeed, this cylinder, much like the faience picture I showed earlier, is an evocative example of the kinds of cross-cultural entanglements that were generated throughout the Hellenistic period. Let's move on from inscriptions and writing and now turn to the ways that royal dynasts and artists that worked on behalf of royal dynasts devised ways to convey these important ideas about queens and queenship visually. And here I want to spend some time focusing on the Jewgate portrait. So, much like the public dynastic family monuments, the Jewgate portrait directly communicated these ideas very effectively in a visual format. Jewgate portraits refer to the representations of two and very rarely, but sometimes three side-by-side portraits that are typically in profile that demonstrate the proximate relations of those represented to each other, and ultimately to signify the importance of kin relations and dynastic unity, legitimacy, and stability. Taking a very close look at this gold coin minted at Alexandria under the reign of Ptolemy II, multiple family relations and roles of queenship are represented here. Starting with the obverse on the left, Ptolemy II is represented in the foreground, while his sister and wife, Arsinoe II, is represented at the same scale, but in the background. The legend reads Adelphon, or of the siblings, directly referencing both their divine status as sibling gods and quite literally their blood relation to each other, or their sibling relation to each other. Moreover, look carefully at how their faces are rendered. These two spousal siblings share the exact same physiognomic features. They could be twins, thus further emphasizing their relation to each other. Now, on the reverse of this exact same coin is a picture of their parents, or Theon, the gods, Ptolemy I and Berenike. Now, what's really interesting is that Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II share certain features with their father and other features with their mother. Thus, the Jewgate format, along with the particular features that we've identified together on this coinage, work together to stress multiple lines of relationality within a dynastic family. From the Hellenistic period, Jewgate portraits also appeared on glyptic art and in ceilings, in addition to coinage. Here's a drawing of one of the many ceilings excavated from the Archives building at Seleucia on the Tigris in modern Baghdad province in Iraq. Out of the tens of thousands of ceilings and impressions recorded by the Italian excavators, 246 ceilings from a total of 95 unique ruler portraits were found. Victor Messina and Fabrizio Molo identify 51 matrices of Seleucid royal portraits through a comparison between ceilings and numismatic evidence. Now, while the number of royal ceilings is small relative to the entire corpus of ceilings found in the Archives building, that royal ceilings exist at all, given their low survival rates overall, is very, very significant. Remarkably, some of these impressions, like the drawing that I'm projecting here, depict Seleucid dynastic women behind the faces of kings in Jewgate fashion, and we know that they're royal thanks to their diadems. These examples have been dated to the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries, but this particular ceiling, inventoried as object SE43, is said to represent Laodike V, alongside or behind her brother and husband, King Demetrius I, who ruled during the first half of the 2nd century. And these identifications are made entirely on comparison with numismatic evidence. It's significant that royal and non-royal people perhaps used the faces of dynastic men and women to sign or guarantee official documents of a courtier. Here, these clay bullae illuminate the stakes of queenship and its representation via Jewgate portraiture for the way this particular format appeals to the importance of a woman's kinship responsibilities as consort and or mother to the king in the maintenance and expression of dynastic power. Now, in addition to brother, sister, and husband-wife pairings, our corpus of evidence includes mother-son pairings, and even groups, as I mentioned, of 3 busts instead of 2. In very rare cases, women take the foreground while men are relegated to the background. Here's one example of such rare imagery. Cleopatra Thea, the Ptolemaic princess turned Seleucid queen, is diademed, veiled, crowned, and in front of, and in the foreground of the obverse, on the obverse side of the coin, with her first husband, Alexander Balas, who is in the background. On the reverse, the coin's legend reads of Basileus Alexander, or of belonging to the King Alexander, encircling an Isis headdress, which was an attribute associated with Ptolemaic queenship. Although the figure in the foreground is unnamed, historians agree on Cleopatra Thea's historical identification because we know from different historical sources that the Seleucid king Alexander Balas was diplomatically married to Cleopatra Thea, and because of the iconography associated with Ptolemaic femininity on the reverse. Now, so much so that historians Sheila Auger and Craig Hardiman argue that, quote, the image is so clearly Egyptian and Ptolemaic that the message could not have been lost on the peoples of the Seleucid Empire. Thus, by visually foregrounding Cleopatra Thea alongside recognizable attributes of Ptolemaic queenship, what happens is that this coin or these images help to at least symbolically ensure Ptolemaic political dominance across the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia. Therefore, we have a twist on the Jewgate format. A woman appears in front of a man. But this Jewgate configuration signals but this Jewgate portrait did something more than just signal their spousal kinship. Not only does it signify dynastic stability in the ways that other couple portraits or family portraits did, but it also symbolizes a particular geopolitical order, perhaps legitimizing Ptolemaic power in a Seleucid realm, another way in which the representation of the queen portrays power. Now, up until now, I've introduced several different monuments, objects, inscriptions, and then talked about different examples of Jewgate portraiture that illustrate the deliberate ways in which kinship was conceived as a central aspect of queenship. And I'm going to wrap up this talk by diving deeper into an object that I showed at the very beginning, the faience pitcher that I introduced at the top of this hour. With this final case study, I build on my discussion, which thus far has introduced a variety of different kinds of visual and material culture that exemplify the place of kinship in the conceptualization of queenship. And with this object, I hope to draw out the stakes of this particular contour of queenship and how it informed both artistic production and ritual practice. So this vessel is just one of about 300 mold-made faience Onakoi fragments of varying quality, size, and preservation status that have been identified and cataloged as part of the corpus of so-called queen's vases. It belongs to a fairly large and uniform corpus of mostly fragmented faience pitchers created on behalf of the cult of the Ptolemaic dynastic family. These vessels have been excavated, or 90% of them have been excavated from areas around Alexandria, in particular tomb contexts. But we've also located fragments from areas outside of Alexandria, so areas in Lower Egypt, as well as contexts outside of Egypt, including at Athens, Crete, Cyprus, Carthage, and Xanthos. The majority of these vessels date to the 3rd century, when the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt had expanded its territorial and political claims across the Mediterranean into parts of Syria, Cyprus, and Libya. So what of their production? Now, archaeologists have identified workshops for mold-made and incised faience objects at Naucratis, Thebes, Memphis, and Karnak. And though there's no archaeological evidence linking the production of these vessels to a royal workshop, much of Ptolemaic royal image production took place with the patronage of the royal court itself, as well as the important and strategic support of the Egyptian priesthood. Given the materials, mode of production, and iconographies, scholars agree that these objects were produced for ritual purposes during festivals on behalf of Ptolemaic dynastic cults and only later treasured as burial objects. So what we see here is a woman standing in active contrapposto pose, offering a libation to a 4-horned altar before her, while an empty cornucopia is nestled in her left arm. She's fully clothed with a chiton hymation veiled over her coiffure. And even though her clothing completely covers her body, the fabric appears to accentuate her breasts and her erogenous zones. While her body is represented frontally, her head is in profile. Now, before her, you can see a wreathed altar, and behind her, you'll see a garlanded tall pillar. These features, architectural features, immediately mark the scene as a sacred setting. And what I find fascinating about these jugs, at least the well-preserved ones, is that in comparison to the architectural features, the female figure appears very monumental in size. Etched across the altar in Greek is an inscription that translates to the good fortune of Queen Berenike, immediately identifying the queenly figure as the historical Queen Berenike II. Usually the Nakoi are decorated with, similarly to this, a queen wearing a chiton hymation. Sometimes she's wearing an Isis costume. And in addition to Berenike II, other queens and figures who are found in inscriptions include Arsinoe II, and then a very handful of examples are named for Cleopatra I and King Ptolemy IV. These vases also include epithets like Agatha Touquet, or good fortune, Philadelphus, sibling loving, and the ones for Berenike II mention the Theoi, Uergetai, or the benefactor gods. All of these, right, or the majority of these, do represent queens adorned in jewelry, decked out in the finest wares, and then holding out a fiale libation. So together, the iconographies and the inscriptions articulate the theme of the divine royal household, while the object itself facilitated ritual behavior on behalf of the queen and the dynastic family. Let's turn more closely to the imagery again. So as I've already mentioned, the sacral elements, along with the queen's stature and overall representation, aid the viewer in interpreting the figure as a physical manifestation of the queen as divine goddess within a ritualizing setting, whether in the space of a temple or on the street in front of a devotee's house. But what's so curious about this image is that the queen herself, who is a deified figure, is represented as participating in the maintenance of the cult of and on behalf of the sacred dynastic household and its members. As Branko van Open de Ruyter's reading of the faience vases argues, the queen is, quote, participating in her own cult, bringing a wine libation for herself and her husband. As such, this object begins to show us that the Ptolemies projected an image of themselves as highly invested and actively involved in the maintenance of their dynastic family cults. In Toronto, an intriguing limestone stela is carved and painted with a scene that should broadly recall the general schema of the Onakoi, although albeit in a very different style. So you see a winged solar disk with two uraei and two royal figures that stand on either side of a four-horned altar, or rather a horned altar. On the left side is Arsinoe II, who we identify by her crown, despite the empty cartouche. And she holds out a staff with her right hand behind her body, a significantly different convention that we see in canonical Egyptian imagery, which typically represents their queens carrying their staffs in front of them. And with her left hand, you see the queen pouring a libation from a fiale to the altar. In the right field is probably Ptolemy II presenting wine offerings to the divine, to his divine and deceased sister. Now, this image corresponds with the faience vessels in that royal actors model the kinds of ritual behaviors that were expected of worshippers. Yet this stela also illustrates the expectations that worshippers may have had of the royal couple themselves. Ptolemy bears an offering for the cult of his deceased sister and wife, Arsinoe, and Arsinoe appears to reciprocate this behavior in the presence of the king, offering a libation to an altar. Above all, the two figures encounter each other, reinforcing the divine status of the Ptolemaic dynasty. And I forgot to mention that there is another example of this sort of non-canonically Egyptian format of holding the staff, right, outwards from the body. You can tell here in this very fragmented Onakoi piece that the queen must have held something outward with her right hand. And I'd like to imagine that it is a scepter of some sort, although there is no fiale libation in this case then. Reading these images through the framework of queenship that we've explored together for the past 40 minutes or so, we find that these faience vases document the very ways in which the dynastic family was viewed as divine by both the dynastic family itself and its loyal subjects. Moreover, this object speaks to the material, performative, and symbolic intensity of their piety. In this world, queens served as both models for ritual action and reflected ideal, pious, feminine behavior. Now, what's really interesting on this Getty vessel is that the artist modeled the queen's body as if freezing her in a state of motion. You can sort of imagine the ways in which she's shifting the weight of her body from left to right, which helps to indicate the force of movement towards the altar. And it's worth noting that this very dynamic portrayal of the queen seems to contrast with other examples of late classical and Hellenistic portraiture of women in which they appear static. And I just want to bring to your memory the image of the Carian dynastic woman here, in which it seems that she too is frozen in a state of action. Now, although scholars readily accept that these faience Onakoi played a role in the ritual libation process, it's noteworthy that the vessels in the queen's hand is a fiale, which does not correspond with the shape of the vessel on which the picture appears, a pitcher or an Onakoi. So one might imagine the ways that wine or liquid from this Onakoi could have been directly poured into a fiale, making the jug an object that facilitated the depicted ritual action. So the imagery does not include the object on which it is represented. Of course, it's possible that these faience vases were not used at all for ritual libations, And in this scenario, this vessel would have been primarily a display object whose imagery portrays and preserves a ritualizing action performed by and or on behalf of the Ptolemaic queen. Now, I've argued that by representing the queen in action, the object directs the viewer and the owner of this vessel to comport themselves in ways that correspond with queenly behavior. And what I think is really interesting to kind of imagine is the ways in which, even though we know our Sinuese cult attracted and drew on the devotion of all genders, I'm interested in sort of imagining what it may have been like or rather to imagine what demands this object may have made, in particular on women and girls. And here there's a lot of research, including my own research, that kind of thinks about the ways in which queenly behavior or queens modeled ideal feminine behavior for women and girls, and the ways in which their acts of patronage involved women and girls and explicitly benefited women and girls. And we have examples of this not only in a Ptolemaic context, but also in an Attalid and Seleucid context. So what I'm trying to sort of get at, right, very quickly, because I'm just looking at the time, is that such invitations that these representations and portrayals of queenship make of non-royal viewers to engage, touch, hold, pour, and contemplate these very representations says something actually very vital about the arts of queenship. These arts of queenship not only inspire awe and a sense of divinity, but also demand a sense or create senses of intimacy, sensuality, and also a sense of wonder constituted the range of affective responses that courts and artists aspired to trigger in their viewing and worshiping subjects. In other words, the arts of queenship were not just about representations of historical figures, but about involving you, the viewer, in the kind of emotional attachments that one could create with the figure of the queen through those very representations. And in the case of these faience pictures, such affective responses were encouraged not just by their exuberant materiality and fine craftsmanship, but also by appealing to the Ptolemaic queen's powerful divinity and therefore the dynastic household's divinity. And deeply entrenched in the notion of the divine household is the political responsibility of queenship to be good mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters. So I now want to return, finally, to the question that I began this talk with. What is a queen to you? Besides the symbolic ways in which singular women are queens of nations today, contemporary queenships also serve as provocations for folks who may belong to historically marginalized communities to imagine and sometimes even claim agency and autonomy in contexts where they may not be typically afforded. Taking the contemporary possibilities for queenship together with the particular articulations of queenship in the Hellenistic world that I've covered, what seems clear is that queenship bestows bodily, historical, and political visibility onto the addressee. And it's that particular visibility that gives the term queen and queenship conceptual weight. Now, visibility, as we've seen through this talk, does not equate in any way with actual political agency or ruling power. Indeed, for Hellenistic queens, their visibility was manufactured entirely on behalf of maintaining a particular dynastic and political project. These Hellenistic queens were by and large used as symbols of stability, continuity, and legitimacy. Now, perhaps for some of you, this particular realization might paint a bleak picture for women. Nevertheless, visibility is a promising start, for representing someone at all is a step towards recognizing their existence. It's only by first recognizing a person or community's existence that we can build toward acknowledging their importance and even their humanity. Finally, acknowledging International Women's Day, I firmly believe that there's something powerful in the political possibility, and that there are political possibilities in kinship. Now, that isn't to say that I agree that a woman's primary usefulness is in her familial relation to patriarchs and to men. Truthfully and personally, I dream of more for myself than just being a good daughter and wife and mother. What my explorations of queenship have taught me is that kinship is a vehicle through which you might form alliances, intimacies, and a sense of accountability between yourself and your neighbors, between yourself and strangers. In other words, acts of motherhood and sisterhood are not bound to or by legal frameworks of family by marriage and blood relation, and instead present avenues for creating and maintaining relationships that work towards consensus, mutual regard, and mutual recognition. Thank you very much.
Patricia's going to take some questions, and I'll help find them for her so she doesn't have to root around. We have a number of ones. They overlap a little. I'll try not to make that too clear. I'll merge them if necessary. There are some very practical ones about appearance. For portraits without inscriptions, such as the bone ring, how do you identify a queen or distinguish a queen's image from a goddess or a mythological person?
That is such a great question, and that is a question that art historians themselves really struggle over. In fact, I have to say, here in New York City at the Met Museum, there's this colossal head that it says this is either a Ptolemaic god or, Ptolemaic queen or goddess, right? So that kind of speaks to, I think, the confusion, and I theorize, right? I feel that the sort of confusion may have been deliberate on the part of these royal dynasts, as well as their artists, right, to kind of blur, of course, the identities of human figures who are often deified and worshipped as goddesses themselves, and then goddesses, right, who may not have been assimilated with queens. But to answer your question, there are a number of different key features that sort of signal to art historians that, okay, this might be a royal figure. On the bone ring in particular, we see a strap that wraps around her head, and this is called a diadem. This diadem is sort of one of the biggest kind of more typical bread and butter markers and of adornment, rather, headdresses, excuse me, that give royal status. So you'll find this not just on queens, but also on kings. There's more to say, in fact, about the hairstyle here. This is what we call in scholarship the melon coiffure. Which seems to have been associated with Ptolemaic queens as well, especially throughout the late 3rd and 2nd centuries. And there are other features as well. So in addition to the diadem, we also have things like veils, right? That kind of signal modesty, but also the status of being a wife. In addition to the diadem, the Stephane crown is also a big marker. But at some point, especially in the Ptolemaic realm, you'll find queens dressed in wigs, right, or hair, as well as costumes that are typically identified or associated with the goddess Isis, which again was done on purpose to sort of signal the divinity of these queenly figures. And, there are so many debates about, chicken and the egg debates about whether representations of Isis came first or representations of divinized queens came first. There are debates. I side with the argument that Hellenistic queens were first represented with Isis curls in particular, and then that was later adapted for images of the goddess Isis. Now I feel like I'm rambling, but I hope that my very long answer helped to kind of nuance, but also give some context to your amazing question.
There's a question about the distinction between showing a queen as beautiful and showing someone as powerful. Could you address
That's such a great
that
question.
issue?
Yeah, that is such a great question. So, beauty is a really interesting topic. I don't think it comes as a surprise, and this might be banal to say that beauty is very much socially constructed. Anyone who tries to tell you that there are scientifically proven ways of being beautiful, I don't buy that. And so, if beauty is a virtue of femininity, a virtue of queenship, right? It's worth kind of peeling the layers and kind of thinking about, okay, why is it that this particular body type is conceived as beautiful? So what's really fascinating is that in the Ptolemaic realm, all of the, I didn't include any here, but full-bodied, or rather bodily representations of Ptolemaic queens generally represent them as if they're wearing a naked dress. That is to say, they're fully clothed, right? Because they're modest, and you should never see a queen naked in public space, but they're super sensual, right? Kind of, let me show the faience onakoi again, right? It's like it's sticking to the body, emphasizing the breasts, emphasizing sort of the pubic triangle area, right? Even though she's fully clothed. And this corresponds with the art historical as well as textual information that really speaks to the corporeal responsibility of fertility, right? Which is another aspect of motherhood, right? But a fertility that belonged to the Ptolemaic queen in particular. And there's a lot of interesting, fascinating evidence regarding this. At the same time, we have textual sources that describe the sort of warrior queen Hera, and that she was understood as to be the most beautiful because she was the tallest and the strongest. So what a beautiful woman looked like did vary across these various realms. Some of that has to do perhaps with cultural definitions and cultural differences and approaches to beauty. And I think a lot of this also has to do with the very kind of ideological project of beauty as such, and what it meant, right? The stakes of beauty and the stakes of the queen's body on behalf of these dynastic projects.
We have a question about the relationship between an object's material and function, including its audiences, and the messages it conveys, and how. And do you see different communication strategies or messages depending on the material and function used for the communication?
Okay, so I'm getting that this is a question about how not just imagery and inscriptions, but materials themselves make meaning, right? I love this question. And let's look at this faience object together. The materiality of this faience object, one can explore in a number of different ways. I mentioned sort of speak to the intensity of cross-cultural encounters, right? There's this very sort of self-conscious use of faience to mold together or piece together this vase, which is typically found and associated with Hellenic or Greek context. So that sends one particular kind of message, right? Not just about cross-cultural encounter, but also the kinds of material innovations and artistic innovations that are possible under the Ptolemies. But faience is a really interesting material that by this point in time had been produced for millennia. The Egyptian word for faience is gehennet, which happens to also be the word for lapis lazuli, which is also a blue gemstone that you find, I want to say, quote, naturally, whereas faience is man-made, right? But gehennet also sort of translates to scintillating, to dazzling. And I love the idea that shininess is also a color quality. We have records from the New Kingdom where some kings got the epithet gehennet, right, to sort of speak to the brilliance, or rather the brilliance of this material. This faïence's materiality is grafted onto the kings in the New Kingdom period in particular. So in Egypt, when it comes to faience as a material, there are a lot of ways in which this very innovative and now by the Hellenistic period, historic and traditional material practice, right, makes meaning itself. So I love that question. And I think that this vessel at the Getty Villa, which hopefully, I don't know if it's open yet, but when it does reopen, you all can go and look at the Hellenistic galleries because it's sitting right there.
I think we'll have time for two more questions.
Excellent.
One is a comment about Greek gods on the Parthenon freely mixing male and female. And someone wondered, Susan wondered, did this idea of family power and divine, in some ways, equality rub off on Greek royal families?
So that's such an interesting question because, that makes me wonder, in fact, can we call the relationship between Zeus and Hera, for example, equal, right? Is that even a term that would have made sense to folks in antiquity at all, right? This notion of gender equality, which is a question that I like to think with as a ancient person living in the contemporary world. I mean, I'm not ancient, but a person lover of the ancient, of antiquity, working in our contemporary world where we think so much about equality and the stakes of equality and how we not only achieve equality, but do we see equality in art? So I start with that to say, I think that you can see parity, okay? So perhaps parity between kings and queens, just to make it very simple, between husbands and wives, royal husbands and royal wives. There's a sense of mutual regard, which you began to see at the top of the early 4th century with the Nereid monument, right? Arbenus and his wife are depicted at the same scale. Even though the gestures are different, the poses and their bodies mirror each other, right? So there's this sense of, I want to say, symmetry. But of course, the Nereid monument is the monument to Arbenus, not to Arbenus, his wife. And there's something really serious to be said about the ways in which I think a careful distinction has to be made between visibility and actual agency, right? Just because these women are visible and sometimes in very monumental fashion, that doesn't always align with or equate to actual ruling power and ruling agency. Unfortunately, when you read the art alongside our historical sources. So I wouldn't, to answer your question briefly, I don't see these as equal relationships, but I do see these as, to borrow from the contemporary, partnerships, perhaps, in which the queen is very much a symbolic figurehead, and that her presence is doing something important on behalf of the king. And I would actually say in the United States, right, very different context, but the First Lady, for example, is not equal in power to the president. And in our case, that general blanket essentializing statement works because we've had no women presidents. But the First Lady, though, even though she has no equal power, right, that still her presence and her visibility are still important, at least ideologically, to an administration. And so I like to kind of bring that example in for my students because I think that really helps to kind of conceptualize similar patterns that we see in antiquity.
Thank you. You just brought us to today, which is what a couple of questions asked for. So instead, I will ask you a question about color.
Okay.
And this is our last question. That in coins and on statues, royal faces seem individualized, but their bodies and dress seem standardized. Rulers have been more strongly differentiated if more color was preserved.
So
their dress in particular and ornamentation.
So the question is asking, if color was preserved, would they look more individuated? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think what's really interesting about that question is actually about the purpose of portraiture. So, this particular coin portrait, which we know are coin portraits of historical figures based on the legends in particular and the ways in which we can date these things, um, they're not physiognomic exact likenesses, right? Um, I mean, this is a question that people ask, right? Would these royal folks have sat for a portrait, right? Like we might imagine, today when you get your portrait taken, you sit for a photographer or a painter or whatever. Um, I actually think it's useful to kind of get away from this question of individuation and physiognomic likeness and think more about kind of what each of these features might mean and might signal. So, in the case of this Jugate portrait coin, I think what's fascinating here is not the question of whether or not the Ptolemies really had like these huge bulging eyes, by the way, which is a common feature that we find across a lot of Ptolemaic portraiture, by the way. Or rather, or if they had these particular noses or these particular chins, right? So that question is less important to me. The question that I'm interested in is why do they look like identical twins? Why do they pick up on some of the features of their mother versus their father? What does that mean? So that's what I'd have to say on portraiture. And in terms of color, yes, I mean I think that by now there's a lot of really like solid evidence that our sculptural records, or rather sculpture in antiquity was highly painted, and it's through this painting that further embellishment could happen and individuation and differentiation could happen through pigment. I just want to shout out Jennifer Steger's work on color in the ancient Greek world, which is fascinating and kind of thinks about cosmesis and transformation. As far as color on royal queens portraiture goes, I don't know of any studies that sort of focus on that, but I'd be really interested to learn about that, in fact.
Thank you. So as usual, with any ancient talk, we end with questions.
Exactly. Lots of them.
So I would really like to thank Dr. Kim for joining us today. I also want to point out that the exhibition on queenship that she's curating for the Cincinnati Art Museum is actually scheduled to come to the Getty in 2027. So you can not only by then have read her book, but also travel to the museum to see the exhibition. Thank you, viewers, for joining us today and for asking your questions. Remember that you can visit getty.edu for information about more programs, and we hope to see you online and at the Villa in the future. Thank you and bye.